G'day folks, welcome to VJ Day. The end of the 1937 campaign comes in autumn, August, September 1945. And here's the situation at the end of the game. Certainly a fairly strong final push by the Allies. Britain finally entered the war in May, June 1945. Not much they can do though. Siam is still neutral, so they can't come through here towards Saigon. They don't have any forces here. There's only sort of 4 steps of colonial infantry that can move. They've only got that one attack factor, so they can't really. I mean, there's still Japanese headquarters here, and basically 4 defensive steps plus the city. And the mountainous region, so not much happening there. But down the south here, you can see some Australian and New Zealand forces. They've moved up through Papua and then across to the Celebes. I guess they had a long-term plan to move on to Borneo and try and recapture the Netherlands East Indies. You can see here the Philippines has been secured by the US, and the Marines have moved over to Formosa. They've captured Okinawa. That fell pretty quickly, and Iwo Jima fell earlier. But, of course, you can see all those Japanese forces in the home islands. The Japanese has brought everything back, defending those home islands and those Axis strategic hexes. The Western forces dominate the seas. They have so many CV fleets. I think they've got 1, 2, it's such a long stretch to get up here, maybe three CV fleets. And again, when these are spent, they're coming back quite quickly because of their modifier. The US commitment level is up to 4. You can see that up here, which gives them a -3 delay modifier. So, yeah, most of the time, they are almost coming back immediately. But they couldn't crack the Japanese home islands. They've just brought everything back here. So it's such a strong defensive position in Japan here for the Japanese. And the Americans were basically trying to do everything else but invade Japan. So Okinawa, Philippines, Formosa, Even with all that going on, with losing the Pacific, the Japanese finally managed to capture Novosibirsk. They got very lucky there with the die roll. And they managed to get another China incident to influence Xinjiang. And that was already under their influence, so it came over to their side. And they secure another Soviet strategic hex. So the Russians just holding on to Omsk up here. It's the only hex they have left. So, yeah, it's in the final VP count, when that VJ Day marker comes out, I count 15 Allied strategic hexes under Japanese control, minus 1, 2, 3, 4, gives the Japanese plus 11 strategic value for 3 victory points and the victory. As I said, there's a long... The Allies will need to reduce this down to 0. So capture 11 more Japanese strategic hexes, or recapture their own strategic hexes to make a dent. So if the war were to continue for another year, they would most certainly capture Balikpapan and Batavia down here. That's 2. Saigon, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're the ones that are probably the easiest to grab. There's still 4 more to go. Maybe 7, 8, 9, 10. And then what? Then they invade the home islands, or they move further north into Hope. I mean, Hope is a Japanese dependent. They've got a lot of forces up there. Yeah, so it's very interesting. I don't know. Yeah, even with another year of war, I don't know if the Allies could have won this. So how did the Japanese win? Well, let's think back. So you may recall if you've watched, I think it was in 1939, 1940, they swung around behind Chongqing here, caught all the nationalist Chinese forces by surprise and kind of cornered them, trapped them in Jiangsu, destroyed them, knocked nationalist China effectively out of the war. I mean, they're still, I think, technically in the war. Maybe I've played those rules wrong. It doesn't really matter because they have not been a factor in the war for many, many years. Once they had secured sort of China and there are no nationalist Chinese forces on the board, they had this all these land forces, and they had two choices here. Move them into the Pacific or go against Russia. Now, at this stage, Russia, the Soviets didn't have many forces on the board. They were basically up in their cities defending, and the Japanese figured they'd be a softer target. Part of this is also, I've got to say, my inexperience with the naval and support rules. I thought, well, this is going to be easier for me to do. I won't have to worry about supply convoys, transport convoys, and so forth. The land war is easier for a new player. So I went against Russia, and it proved to be very successful because they shifted everything up. Because Britain wasn't in the war, I didn't have to worry about all their colonial troops. Because America, the US, didn't have their support units yet, they weren't a threat at all for a long time. So the Japanese were free to focus everything on Russia. They sent everything north, captured all those Russian VP hexes, the strategic hexes. That was slowed down around Ulaanbaatar and the northern area there. Took them some time to capture those final few hexes. But by this stage, they'd eliminated so many of these Russian forces, and the Russians struggled to get replacements. The Soviets just cannot rebuild their forces like the other forces can. Every time they seem to do so, they're pushing up that ESV value. Now, I was tempted to play this a few times, but as I mentioned in some of the videos, this ESV value, this European European war display, it can increase randomly. And for example, it's currently sitting at 2 at the end of the war. Now, if I were to increase that to 4 and do some Soviet production, all it takes is a bad die roll, and I've pushed it up to ESV 5 with an Axis total victory instantly. Now, I didn't want that to happen, so I've been trying to keep it at 2 or less. So yeah, the Japanese did that and effectively knocked Russia out as a threat. And once they had reached sort of Tanu, Tuva, Siberia, they brought their forces back south. They began to garrison the Pacific Islands, which slowed the Americans down. By this stage, the Americans were starting to turn the tide in the balance of support surface fleets, CV fleets. Right around the time the Japanese were very quickly garrisoning all those islands. They also began to garrison the home islands and parts of China. And as they're doing that, the Americans are building up their forces. This is around 1943. It's a little bit late in the historical timeline. So 1943, the American surface fleets, CV fleets, begin to outnumber the Japanese, and they begin their offensive, starting with the Marshall Islands. They didn't worry about Truk here. This is very well defended by 2 pretty strong garrisons, so the Americans didn't worry about capturing that. They captured Iwo Jima quite quickly by surprise, thanks to those lucky events. Then they invaded the Philippines, and this, the defense of Davao here just slowed the Americans down. The Japanese just reinforcing the hex. They had a few steps here, and they could just hold out month after month against these US attacks. They eventually brought over superior numbers with air support and so forth, and captured it very, very late in the war, then quickly moved against Manila and Apari. But yeah, as I said, by that stage it was way too late. And then, of course, the Commonwealth forces moving out. So I think the Japanese won because they were able to concentrate their forces against the Chinese, knock out the Chinese, and then against the Russians, remove the Russians as a threat. And then by that stage, they were ready to defend against the superior naval force of the Americans and the Western forces. And they were able to hold on really well to the end of the war. They really only lost... At one point, they were up to plus 14 strategic value. They've only lost 3 of those strategic value hexes. Again, they've gained 2 up there, and they've lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So +2 -5 is a -3 from their maximum expansion in the Pacific. And of course, they still hold the Western Carolina Islands, Eastern Carolina Islands, Formosa. They've still got a base down in Borneo. They're still in a very good position. As I said, hypothetically, if the war were to continue for another year, I reckon the Japanese would still be in a winning position. Another 2 years, the Americans really need to be very aggressive at this stage. As soon as they get this, I'm learning a lot, but as soon as they get that naval supremacy, they need to use that and attack, and use everything they have to hurt the Japanese. Look, there's certainly scope for me to have played things wrong. The Japanese just seem to get so many replacements with their Haku Ichu marker. Their forced pool is almost empty of possible replacements. They're all out on the board. Certainly their early play of the sort of economic cards helped them immensely. War production brings these forces back more whenever they spend a surface fleet throughout 1939, 40, 41, 42. Whenever they're spending a surface fleet or whatever, Air Force, it's coming back very quickly. And certainly in 1940, 41, the Americans were being penalised whenever they used a fleet by their detrimental delays. Then this turns around in 1943. So yeah, this is the end of the campaign. It's a Japanese victory. I'm going to do a completely separate review and summary of gameplay, but just sort of give those final thoughts on how this campaign played out. Japanese victory because they could destroy the Chinese, then destroy the Russians, and then just hold out superbly well against the Americans, with the British coming in far too late to make much of a dent in that Japanese position. So that is the complete 1937 campaign from Axis Empire's Dai Senso, ending in a Japanese victory.